welcome everybody to the 2023 learning series. I cannot believe it's 2023, but here we are with our learning series, the Child, Family, and Community Wellbeing Learning Series. This year's learning series is intended to support county prevention teams and cross-sector partners build the capacity towards the creation of a prevention continuum and infrastructure that is anchored in race, equity, and inclusion, social justice, and tribal sovereignty. The title and focus of this year's learning series is intentionally different. This year, we are focused on making real our vision for children, families, and communities. The CPP is in service to that goal of creating well and thriving communities where families are strong, children are safe, and tribes are sovereign. This year's learning series will be structured differently than last year's. For the comprehensive prevention planning series, we were focused on providing you with the necessary information, tools, and guidance to develop your county prevention plans for submission to the state. The learning forms were lengthy, dense, and in an information out format. While we believe that was developmentally necessary and appropriate, we did listen to your feedback and have made some adjustments to this year's series. First, the forms will be 2 hours in length versus 3. So you'll have more of your day after attending one of these forms. Second, the meeting format will allow for interaction with our presenters and an opportunity for peer sharing and learning. As Dana J. mentioned, today there will be times that we will encourage you to put questions and comments in chat and to even come off mute to ask questions. Given the fact that we will have that type of interaction built into our learning form, we will not have the Q&A sessions with the presenters as we did last year. The features of the forms that we didn't change are the fact that we will provide you with tangible resources and tools for you to take back to your planning teams to apply to your implementation efforts. We will continue to bring content experts from California and nationally to provide strategies and examples of best practice. And we will continue to pay attention to your feedback after each session so we can make improvements along the course of the series. Next slide, please. Today's topic, equity as context, attacking disproportionality head-on, is a critical framework that must be embedded in all of our prevention efforts. If we want to create a child, family, and community well-being system, we must do at least 2 things. First, we must focus our effort on upfront primary and secondary strategies that meet the needs of marginalized communities. Second, we must understand those communities through a lens of equity so that disproportional and disparate outcomes are eliminated. It is not okay for some communities to be healthy and well while other communities are not. California, in its wisdom, recognized the limitations of the Family First Prevention Services Act, and that poor and vulnerable families would not see improvements in their health and well-being unless they funded an expansion to FFPSA, so that counties could create a prevention continuum that focused more upstream and was community-centric and socially just. Each learning form will have a through line of race equity and inclusion and tribal sovereignty. Each of the learning forms will start with an acknowledgement of our collective history as a step towards reconciliation and a constant reminder of our intentions, purpose, and goals for why we are coming together. In order to address centuries of collective harm and trauma to African American and Native American, we must make an intentional choice to rebuild communities in an equitable manner. I acknowledge that I'm sitting on the traditional territory of the Kahula people, who are the rightful owners of the land we now call the Coachella Valley. I also want to acknowledge and pay my respect to our African ancestors for the enslaved forced labor they had to endure for this country's development and economic progress. We're going to drop a couple of links into the chat, and we highly encourage everybody to research on these aspects of our history as they are critical to the work that we are doing. Next slide. So let's get to it. I want to introduce our presenters today. First, we have Edward Jones, who is Vice President of Programs and Philanthropic Advising Services at ABFI, a philanthropic partnership for Black communities. In his role, he leads philanthropic professional development and convening activities, as well as supports the design and implementation of the organization's racial justice and equity program initiatives for over 900 plus members and partners across the globe. Welcome, Edward. Second, I'd like to introduce Yolanda Green Rogers, Senior Policy Analyst with Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. Yolanda works with public and private child welfare agencies across the country on the implementation of continuous quality improvement practices that support performance monitoring and decision-making. Welcome back, Yolanda. And Leanne Heaton, Senior Researcher, Data Manager at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. Leanne serves as the Principal Investigator and/or Research and Evaluation Lead on several state-funded human services public policy initiatives and supervises a team of researchers and analysts. Welcome, Leanne. And finally, but not least, Dr. Kush Cooper, who will serve as our moderator today and throughout the series. Dr. Cooper is the President and CEO of Implematics and is an adjunct professor at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, as well as the CEO of Implematics, a consulting firm serving public and private organizations in the areas of foster care reform, LGBTQ youth and systems, implementation science, and leadership development. Kush, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you, colleagues. I appreciate sitting in such august company. I, too, want to acknowledge living and working on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Chumash, Tongva, and Tataviam peoples, who are the rightful owners of the land we now call the San Fernando Valley. So, why are we starting at equity? You might be asking. Why isn't this learning series about evidence-based programs for the families that are closest to our system? Well, we're starting here because we're going to go all the way upstream. But before we do that, we're going to launch a data poll. So it looks like 88% of you are looking at your data by race and ethnicity, and 12% of you are not. So we want to keep that ratio in mind as we progress through this conversation. Okay, so I'm going to share the results. No, 88% yes, 12% no. Close this out and we can get back to the conversation. So we have been talking a lot throughout this learning series and all the work that I do with counties and all the consultants with whom I convene over this work. And we've been talking a lot about going upstream in this prevention planning conversation, and everyone is for it. We have agreement that primary prevention addresses many of the root causes of child maltreatment. We are going to start all the way upstream, perhaps even before primary prevention. You may be wondering, is there further upstream than primary prevention? while the prevention continuum that we've been talking about, that we've been working together to design, is being designed to create continua to prevent child maltreatment writ large, in the interest of that, as we start to traverse this stream, each tier of prevention, if you really start to examine what each tier of prevention is intended to do, you can start to see that they're preventing something distinct at each level, all in the interest of preventing child maltreatment, but you're preventing something distinct at each level. And we're going to get into that in a moment. But for this narrative to resonate with you, I invite you to set a couple of bits for yourself. One, think of the disease or the condition that we're talking about here, since we borrowed this model from public health, not as child maltreatment, where parents are perpetrators or caregivers are perpetrators and children are victims, but perhaps think of the condition or the disease here as toxic stress and chronic trauma, which underlies most family violence. Maybe child maltreatment is the symptom, not the condition itself. You have to stop blaming the family for child maltreatment for this narrative to work. So then, what is it, the source? Who is at fault? Maybe the ultimate culprit isn't an individual or a family. Maybe it's a social condition, one we all tolerate and allow at some level. So back to this conversation then, we've set those 2 bits. Back to this conversation about what's being prevented exactly at each tier. Tertiary prevention, the most downstream tier of prevention, so to speak. The strategies at this level prevent child maltreatment from recurring for the most part. Something bad has already happened. Something damaging has already happened in the family, and we want to prevent its recurrence for those families. Secondary prevention, going a little bit further upstream, these strategies prevent those families at risk of child maltreatment they prevent issues with those families that are due to risk exposure and lack of protective factors in unhealthy communities. So secondary prevention aimed at those families at risk of child maltreatment. And why are they at risk? Risk exposure and lack of protective factor in unhealthy communities. So then to follow that logic further upstream, primary prevention strategies prevent communities from becoming unhealthy by focusing on the social determinants of health for those community members, okay? So then we have to ask ourselves, well, what causes unhealthy communities in the first place? How did we get to the point where folks were living in unhealthy communities where they were at risk, where the protective factors are seeping away? Inequity. Historic systemic inequity are what cause communities to become unhealthy in the first place. And this is the condition, perhaps, that we all tolerate and allow on some level. That is the ultimate culprit for child maltreatment. So perhaps the families aren't to blame. Perhaps it's the social condition of inequity. Turns out there is a level of prevention before primary prevention if you actually look at the public health literature. It's called primordial prevention. And primordial prevention targets the underlying stage of family violence by targeting the underlying social conditions, which I assert are inequity based, that promote its onset. So if we start with equity, we get a shot at the most return on investment possible. We are all the way upstream. It's going to take a lot of that investment up front to do this, both emotional and capital. But given, pulling on some of what Dana said, we have a state block grant. We don't have automation yet to claim FFPSA funded evidence-based programs for particular candidates at imminent risk. Given those two conditions, we're recommending we start here. So what does this look like? What does it look like to start here? What would you start to see happening on the ground in communities? Well, you'd start to see communities being restored to health. You would see increased investment in community. You would see actions that look like targeted universalism, which we're going to get into with our next speaker. So I won't say a whole bunch on that right now. It would look like activities around community healing and restoring self-efficacy to communities rather than having communities rely on systems to get them what they need. It would look like coming from and accounting for tribal sovereignty in planning conversations and continuum of care design discussions. And it would look like encouraging mutual aid, activities that encourage mutual aid within communities to ultimately render systems involvement obsolete. Right? The cliche we use here is we want to work ourselves out of a job. So now I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Edward Jones, to set sort of the meta context here, the meta context of racial equity and inclusion, inside of which we're recommending you nestle any and all design and implementation work when it comes to prevention. Edward, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Kush. It is a pleasure being here with you all. I'm really happy that I hit the unmute button before I started speaking. So I got to celebrate all the little wins that happen in our world. It really, again, is a pleasure being a Los Angeles native, living on the East Coast, but understanding so many of these things that we experience are, they transcend zip codes, the challenges as well as opportunities. And so when we talk about these issues, such as equity, racial equity, social justice, other equities that show up in our spaces, we are understanding this notion that that we're talking about particular conditions and circumstances. The idea of being fair, no matter where you live, no matter what you look like, those things not being a barrier to actually having the elements that we talk about in the society of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, for example. We look at these things in an important way because what we know to be very true is that when we see inequities, all of what Kush has identified and illustrated really gets us away from this idea of an opportunity of us all having same access, all being in conditions that are desirable. How would we want to show up? What would it look like for us? And then we have to think about, how does this show up for other people in our communities? Would we want to walk in the shoes of those that are around us that have been treated inequitably? That's the ways in which we want to show and think about this work. And so when we talk about this notion of targeted universalism, and I'll ask the audience of over 100 folks, have you heard of this phrase before? Have you heard of this notion of targeted universalism? Put it in the chat, say yes or no. There's no bad answer here. Just want to get a sense of how people have heard this work, because we're going to talk a little bit more about it and think too about the fact that for us to really have universally good outcomes, we have to be very strategic and thoughtful around how we get there. How do we really show up fair? How do we create conditions that are fair for everyone? And doing that, even use something, a simple example as the curb cut. The idea that there's this indentation in curbs in most major and small cities that was designed for access for those that may need wheelchair for mobility, it also has other benefits, unintended consequences that actually serve other purposes. Is a simple example of something we take for granted, but it really does serve a useful purpose in our society. And so let's take a moment, Kush, and show folks a definition of what targeted universalism looks like. And then I'll come back to the other side.
What is the most effective and sustainable policy response to problems in our society? Universal approaches are widely used in order to package policies for broad appeal. Universal policies such as Social Security and minimum wage provide the same benefits or minimum protections to everyone, regardless of status or group membership. But by treating everyone the same, universal approaches can't root out group-based discrimination and may actually deepen inequality between groups rather than reduce it. And by providing benefits or protections to everyone, resources that could be targeted to groups worse off instead flow to those who are better off. In contrast to universalism, targeted approaches are commonly used. Targeted policies provide benefits or protections based on group membership or status. SNAP, the food stamp program, conditions benefits on income level. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires public accessibility for disabled groups. And affirmative action focuses on historically disadvantaged groups. Targeted approaches are vulnerable to the critique that they unfairly favor constituent groups over the public good by directing resources to marginalized groups who are already subjected to unfair stereotypes. But universal and targeted approaches are false choices. There is a third way, targeted universalism. Targeted universalism means setting universal goals that can be achieved through targeted approaches. This approach targets the various needs of each group while reminding us that we are all part of the same social fabric. This can be accomplished by following 5 steps. First, set a universal goal. For example, 100% proficiency in 8th grade math. Second, measure how the overall population fares relative to the universal goal. In this example, we might discover that only 80% of 8th graders are proficient in 8th grade math. Third, measure the performance of population segments relative to the universal goal. So although 80% of all 8th graders are proficient, we might find that only 70% of Latinx students are proficient. Fourth, understand how structures and other factors support or impede groups' progress toward the universal goal. For our Latinx students, classroom instruction materials and lessons designed for English speakers may impede learning, including math proficiency. Finally, implement targeted strategies so that each and every group can achieve the universal goal based upon their needs and circumstances. This may take the form of ESL-specific math tutoring for our Latinx students, while another group may require a completely different strategy to achieve the same universal goal. Targeted universalism rejects a blanket universal, which may be indifferent to the reality that different groups are situated differently relative to the institutions and resources of society. By aspiring toward shared universal goals, targeted universalism empowers targeted strategies capable of achieving those goals while moving us beyond concerns over disparities alone and toward our highest aspirations for all.
So I appreciate folks asking for a link. We can definitely provide a link to the video in the chat. My colleagues, I'm sure, are already ready to do that. But if you think about what we're talking about here, what you're going to hear through this distinguished group of partners in this work, and as you're all already undertaking these issues, we're really talking at the end of the day around how can we be really intentional around using the data that we collect, being intentional around determining where are these inequities, and then starting to direct particular supports towards improving outcomes for any of the audiences where we are hoping to affect change positively. And so the next slide, I'll give you an example when we get to talking about these issues as they relate to engagement and folks, whether you're in large or small organizations, if you think about how the government is responding, even at the federal level, which is another part of this partnership, this ongoing work, and they've already taken on through executive order some of the data collection that we're suggesting folks are doing, and many of you are doing based upon the survey that was shared earlier. You're already starting to engage and think about who the members are in the communities where you are doing support and looking to improve outcomes with families and children and the like. You're already starting to think about where there might be places not only for you to collect this data, but also thinking about who else may also have data. Because when we think about this at the larger level of a federal government and how this translates into a smaller county where many of you are doing work, it should really get us and encourage us to think about the ideas that this is not something that is so insurmountable. It's just a matter of thinking more strategically around how we are getting this information and through whom we're getting information. Because in the next slide, if you think about how this shows up, and if you are a kid at heart, or if you have children and loved ones that are in the spaces that you occupy, we'd want all of us to be in this space of swimming, if you will, in nutrient-rich environments, where there are competent teachers, culturally competent teachers particularly, where there's a peer network that is fully supportive of and helps to improve the ways in which you show up. Where if there's not a blood relative, there's fictive kin, there are caregivers that are helping navigate the work for the children and families and the like. We want to think about the ideas of how important these nutrient-rich waters would be that would provide the ideas of family support, income, and the other elements that make and strengthen families. Because conversely, we really find ourselves and we find some of the children and the families that we come in contact with in these waters that are not healthy, that have created circumstances and conditions that have definitely not helped enable positive outcomes. And as Kush had mentioned earlier, oftentimes there's way too many folks that will be willing to blame the victims, those that have been adversely impacted by unfair and disadvantaged conditions, as opposed to looking at what are the issues that have created these inequities in the first place. These situational circumstances obviously have areas of, we can call them inequitable. We can also look, and if you dig deeply, you'll find that many of the situations and circumstances are driven or oftentimes perpetuated through issues such as racial inequity. And inequities, I should say plural, when we think about the ideas that do not allow for fair treatment in myriad systems throughout our, again, federal, state, and local level municipalities, if you will. When we think about these issues and circumstances, oftentimes there is something else that has helped to create that particular outcome. And what we talk about in our work at AFI really gets us to this idea of digging a little bit deeper. The next slide gives us a sense of what's called oftentimes a back map, in which you can take any of those issue areas, any of those disparity points, and put that in the larger gray box, and starting to peel back the layers here. Thinking about who, first of all, when you're wanting to tackle a situation, who's in the room? Who are the folks that are helping you come to terms with this, this challenge, this disparity, if you will? If you're talking about the ideas of something like access to transportation, you may not be a transportation provider in your work, for example, but or may know of others that are doing that work. And so if there's a condition that is being created, the idea of someone getting to childcare or getting to health care appointments could be considered transportation related issues. And if we go back and peel back a little bit to the secondary conditions, we want to think about intentionally around what's causing those circumstances, what's creating that disparity. And then oftentimes when you look at that data point, that issue that is creating that challenge, then you also can find other issues that also then kind of, when you peel back the layer, if you will, that are also causing those issues. And then when you learn and you come to terms with how do you really affect and impact these changes, it really does center on the idea of asking these questions and thinking about who's in the room that can add more understanding around whatever that disparity is. And so oftentimes we find ourselves working in spaces, and we may not have all of the possible voices in the room. And what we're really encouraging you to do is to start talking and thinking about who else in community should be at the table when we're having these conversations. We're looking to tackle a particular issue. Who else might we bring into this conversation that may have another element of understanding around what that disparity is and how it's come to be? So those hindrances that we see on that disparity, that big gray square, could create a multi-layered challenges that show up. And so our goal here is to really get folks to start thinking about it. It's not just that one issue oftentimes. How can we be really intentional around finding out and getting to those root causes? And not just for the sake of getting to the root cause, but also getting to the common and attainable solutions here. So on the next slide, what we talk about in this space is really what's considered an impact analysis. This idea of assessing the circumstances, assessing the potential impact of any new or modified program. So say you've seen a disparity, you've made some solutions, you offered up through community engagement some probable ways and strategies for achieving and improving outcomes. But we really want to think about whatever you've implemented based upon what you've learned, to think about what's the impact. What's the impact, including working to be mindful of what are the unintended consequences of that decision, of that policy, that program, and that investment that you would hope to make to, again, address that issue for the priority or the populations that through your targeted universalism, data collection, the like of thinking about specific targets for specific populations. You want to consider, again, those unintended impacts and what may come from that work. And then engage, be mindful of the engage. This is a continuous loop of continuous building and learning and growing together to where we really think about engaging priority populations, getting communities involved in the process. If you don't have everyone in the room in the one meeting, think about who should be in the room for the next meeting. You don't have to have all the answers. That is not the goal in any of this work. It's always to talk about who else should be in this conversation. And so the next slide, we talk even more around this notion of asking some specific questions. When you are in that space, when you're in the room with some stakeholders, you want to know about, and you want to ask even as you're setting up any engagement, are the people that are most adversely impacted by the disparity that you're naming here, are they represented at the table? Or if you're not convening that table, where else may there be a table that you should ask to be included in, to think about what these spaces are. People may be talking about these issues, but you just may not be aware of it. So we want to intentionally encourage that kind of dialogue and engagement. When you think about the investments or the ways in which you're putting time, talent, treasure, engagement of any type into this work and coming to some decisions, when you're investing and you're making these decisions, you should be considering, the existing or new elements and what are the results that you are trying to achieve. So it's not a matter of just working to tackle a problem, but what is the end game? What are you really hoping to take across at least this phase of the process to improve outcomes? How will those investments, that practice, that decision affect the community of focus? So again, through your work targeting particular populations, think about what this work, these decisions that are made will impact and affect the communities of focus, with the understanding that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Again, it's not a people of color approach, but what's happening to tribal populations and communities, what's happening to Black populations, what's happening to immigrant populations, Native populations, what's happening to white populations in these spaces. Being really intentional gets us again towards more sustainable and more achievable outcomes. And so do you think the achievements and the practices and the decisions of this investments, are they worsening existing disparities faced by the groups that you're working with? Or may they produce any other unintended consequences? So it's not just a matter of that one thing, but are there other things that could also be unintended that could show up in certain conditions that you may have hoped to have achieved, are seen as achievements that may have just created some other conditions that need further exploration and understanding. And this is, again, a continual process. Once you've gone through and asked yourselves these questions in community, you'll want to come back and then tool and retool and rethink this work and in ways in which we again, are constantly working towards the agreed upon a North Star, if you will. And then lastly, one of the last pieces I'll share here is around things that you should consider. Using these things really become an important part of the practice. And again, this is a practice that we encourage folks to embark upon. Don't consider this a one trip, but a journey, a continuous journey towards work. Think about the persistent and often intentional exclusion of marginalized voices in policymaking. Kush talked a little bit about that earlier, and I think it's something that's definitely worth reiterating, underscoring, if you will. There have been communities that have been underserved, underrepresented for a very long time, and the idea of bringing them into these spaces is oftentimes one of the steps that have been overlooked for way too long. Recognition of why these constituencies have not been engaged as much in the past oftentimes shows up in ways that sometimes we just don't want to come to grips with, or we don't necessarily want to own in these spaces. Again, sitting on the idea and this notion of inequitable practices that again have been practiced more so that they become more of the status quo than, and they're not necessarily leading to the outcomes that we would all desire, not only for ourselves, but for the communities where we are. So we understand those consequences and understand these decisions that have had some consequences at the end of the day. Our goals is always to center on making the actual decisions for the good. And centering this experience and working with these historically marginalized communities is not often an easy task for folks that have not really been in the practice of doing that. So it takes work. It takes a commitment. It takes a real strategy that may bring in other new voices, people that you may not have historically worked with. But when you think about the idea of what, again, you're hoping to achieve and are oftentimes hoping to achieve with others that are in the same space, would be the optimal way of doing that is really to be using your resources, using your positions to bring other people into the conversation, or ask to be included in other conversations that are also working towards the goals that you're hoping to achieve. Again, making a sustained commitment to those who you work with, that's how trust happens. So at the end of the day, again, because we know there's been a history of underrepresentation, marginalization, othering communities and others, folk, the idea here is for us to move forward and using the past to help us be more intentional around how we want to move forward in the future. So next, the next slide, again, will just be a reminder for us all to think about this issue that oftentimes I remember growing up, we didn't necessarily, folks didn't want to talk about race. They don't want to talk about certain things in our society. And now I think pretty much we have no choice but to talk about it. But the idea of how we talk about this issue and using the voices of those in community, those that are telling stories that sometimes aren't listened to, the idea of us understanding where we unite around values. We want stronger communities. We want safer communities. We want safer households. We want to really think about how this unity comes about by us understanding where our common goals are. And then thinking too around where there are opportunities that may have not been realized in past practices, those that may have preceded you in this work, ideas in which we've shown up in this space. How do we really start seeing where there are better opportunities for us to move forward and move forward better together? So I'll stop there, Kush, and actually open up if there's questions or take the next step.
Right. And I have been watching the slide deck. And the chat has a lot of no's and yeses in them. So if I've missed any questions in the chat, please let me know, team. Right, and we want to make this as interactive as possible. So I encourage folks to raise your hand and come off mute and have a conversation. Excellent.
Mattia?
Oh yeah, it's Mattia. So first of all, I just want to say thank you guys for inviting me, allowing me to be here. My question, I do have two questions. Well, one's a question and one's really a comment. I'll start with my comment first. So in regards to as to what you were just saying about how to talk about race. And I know you're much older than me. Well, not much older than me, but you're older than me, Mr. Jones. But even me growing up, I can relate to that, to those conversations not being had about race. It's just a really touchy topic, and people like to go around it and really beat around the bush and not talk about certain things that do affect us as Black individuals. So I just kind of wanted to comment on that and say, even though we're from different generations, we have experienced the same thing still. Like, it's not, but I'm not calling you old. And my second question was, if you can, I guess, kind of go back to slide 18 in regards to the racial equity impact analysis. Can you give another example of what would be considered an unintended impact?
Sure. I'll cite one that some of you may have already heard before, and it's the idea around creating safer opportunities for children and families. And so there was a story several years ago that was on NPR, which folks made a really intentional decision around moving families out of what were considered unsafe neighborhoods, right? And then when the young people were moved, what wasn't talked about was the idea of what was a safe space for them. And so moving someone from what's considered unsafe to what's considered a safer space without thinking about the impact of separation from family, movement from community, even the notion of being really intentional around understanding how welcomed or unwelcome people may be when put in a new community is an example of what that looks like.
Oh, okay.
Meaning may be in this work without looking at those unintended consequences or addressing those unintended consequences when they arise. Leads to even other challenges that then again speak to or require additional input or responses.
Mm-hmm.
Does that resonate?
Yeah, that answered my question perfectly. That makes perfect sense. I think I had just missed it and I wasn't too sure. I was trying to think, but I'm like, I don't actually know. So that's how come I just kind of wanted you to go back and just give me a brief example of that. So thank you so much for that.
Sure.
Other questions? None. Edward, before we move on, given we have 2 minutes, I have a question. Yes.
Yes.
Elizabeth.
Oh,
there, Elizabeth. Yes. Thank you. Hi, Elizabeth. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you so much. My question is this: how in this paradigm are you looking to address the mindsets? So we're talking about the social impact, and we're talking about things, how we address the groups, if I could say it that way. In other words, in a community, you can have, I've been in communities where we're looking at planning some changes, and then you have someone in that group that actually has a different belief system, especially racial different. If you've ever experienced KKK, I'm just throwing that out as an example, where there could be a Black community, which I've experienced, folks in a Black community wanting to make some changes, and then you have some folks in this community that are KKK, and they have a different mindset that does not complement the larger goal for that community.
Yeah.
I just wanted to hear his thoughts. Yes, sir. I wanted to just kind of get your thoughts on that.
No, you raise a very important, a reality that we have, particularly we think about, and I'm a political junkie, so I always have to think about what I'm speaking to, but in the general context of how we address these issues and I think I appreciate how Elizabeth and even Matea, you lift up this idea that these are conversations that people don't want to have. And because we've avoided them for so long without recognizing that these situations have existed. You can talk about the KKK today. It looks differently, but it's still the same kind of platform upon which folks have shown up as just a modern, I'd say the same script, different cast. Oftentimes we stifle progress because we're afraid of oftentimes what's really a real minority voice in these spaces, as opposed to really leaning in on the voices that are on board. We often talk about this notion of meeting people where they are, because we don't, we're not a monolithic people. We're not a monolithic nation in this space, but we do have some common sense and thinking around what's right and what's wrong, right? If we think about the ideas of what we would want for ourselves and for our children, irrespective of race or political ideology, it's pretty much the same things, right? The idea of safety, the idea of having fair access to, work, wages, education, the like. How those approaches may look may be different, but I think the idea of us really hanging in on, and one of the slides around identifying where, one of the bullet points is about thinking about, where are we unified? Where are we connected? And start from there. Start from that standpoint of where do we agree? And then the other elements of disagreement also oftentimes find themselves, at least in conversational, once you get to an understanding and an appreciation and respect for the person that you're in the room with or in the conversation with. But it's not an easy path at all. I would not suggest that, but it does require a commitment, and a commitment that does require more long-term than a short-term proposition. If we think we can resolve these issues, we've been going through this stuff for decades. It's been a cycle. If you think about it, we come full circle because we've not taken made those intentional commitments about how we're going to keep moving forward. And we've made strides and progress, but oftentimes those setbacks become more concentrated and more enhanced because we've not figured out how to tackle those things in a targeted way. I hope that helps.
Sure. I just think it's in various conversations that, when we're talking about planning and we're talking about dealing with disproportionality, I think one piece of the conversation we miss is the mindsets and the belief systems based on our upbringing, based on our culture, based on what our own lived experiences. And there has to be something to hope for in order for me to want to change those. I mean, that's for all of us. So I think those are just reality conversations, like you said, that we have to have if we're going to make such changes and systemic changes at that.
Totally agree. I think you're going to hear so much great tools and thoughts in the upcoming presentations on this topic too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And we will have more time for questions at the end, if all goes as planned. So please hold on to the questions if we didn't get to them right this moment. Okay, so there are a whole sequence of investments, practices, and decisions, as the slide here shows, that counties and tribes are going to have to make with regard to setting up this prevention continuum. And the first one of those is for whom? For whom are you setting up this prevention continuum? So where are you going to find, and how are you going to find those populations disproportionately represented in your systems? So, and where are you going to look to find what their needs are, and how are you going to decide what strategies are going to meet those needs? Those are all decisions you're going to have to make. So the next group of presenters is going to start to take us into, all right, so what am I looking for when I'm looking at these data? What am I looking for? So I'm going to welcome Yolanda Green-Rogers and Leanne Heaton from Chapin Hall. And Yolanda, I believe you're going to start us off.
I am.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Kush. And thank you so much, Edward, for that wonderful context setting to get the conversation started. So good afternoon, everybody. I greet you from the wonderful, beautiful, sunny 28-degree Chicago. I'm so jealous of whatever temperature it is there right now. So for the next part of the forum, we'll focus on engagement and measurement strategies. We're going to talk through a few strategies that might be applied as you focus on equity in your prevention work and programming. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, we're at the goals. So I'm here again with my colleague, Leanne Heaton, who's going to share some best practices for collecting data and using it to measure disproportionality and disparity, and share a brief example that applies some of those concepts using some California publicly available data. And then I'm going to share some strategies for engaging community partners in the work of using the data to understand and collaboratively seek solutions for why there may be disproportionality and disparities in the data that you're looking at. Next slide. So we think it's important to approach this work around promoting equity, informed and operating from a set of guiding principles, some posturing to take as you start to move into this work, and to make sure these principles align with your current vision and mission that your organization is operating from. So principle 1 around identifying specific strategies and oversight. So approach this work with a strategy, identifying what you want to accomplish, what oversight and accountability actually looks like within your organization for governing this work, for ensuring equity and ensuring that it's always a consideration within the work you're doing. Principle 2, so there's a clear power differential in this work, especially when we talk about the state agency or your local DSSs. So acknowledging the role your organization has played in the community and being prepared to listen and be super humble and open and having a collaborative posture and approach to the community. Principles 3, 4, and 5 are related. So these are all around seeking out and including the voices of those impacted by the work. So this current rallying request from the communities, nothing about us without us. I'm sure most of you have heard that. So really taking that into consideration and activating that. Those who have experiences with systems can give us critical perspective on what's happening that's usually missing when we're having our own internal organizational conversations. Be thoughtful about the teams you put together. So thinking about the various skill levels and experiences you need reflected on your teams to approach this work in various equity projects or projects in general, and making sure equity is infused. So again, that's adding youth and family voice to possibly your CQI teams, or in other words, your continuous quality improvement teams or strategic planning teams. And as someone mentioned, this is individual work. This is very much individual work and collaborative work that we have to do in this space. And we should be intentional and consistent with examining our own and our collective and individual biases about race and how those biases impact our behavior, our relationships, and decision-making. Throughout the work, make sure strategies, interventions, and potential solutions are trauma-informed and won't do more harm than good. And Edward alluded to that, and Mattia had a great question around that space. And then finally, advancing equity, as we all know, is a journey, a developmental process, and organizations are at different places along that journey. So there's a need to balance the urgency that we know is required to address inequities and with where the organization, and balancing that with where the organizations, where your organization is developmentally. Next slide. So what are some concrete things you can do to lay the groundwork? And I'm just going to talk about a couple of things, and then I'm going to turn it over to Leanne to dig into the data. Then we're going to come back to some of these pieces. But what are a few concrete things, again, just to get you set up, to get us set up to lay the groundwork for getting critical perspectives to our table or going to those tables? The people you need to engage have more than an interest. They actually have solutions. A good first step is to gather the foundational information needed to effectively engage local leaders, lived experts, and your workforce. Acknowledge the agency's role in this work. So this is related to that humility principle we just talked about. So acknowledging the agency's positionality in the work and in the community, and engage in presenting with humility. Getting a clear understanding of how the community views your organization, how children, families, sister agencies in the community experience your organization as well. And that can be very enlightening to think through. Consider how the community would want to be approached. Are there trusted community leaders who could be engaged first as champions or partners to help with larger engagement efforts? And then seeking the community's perspective on certain issues. And using the right language, gathering information on how the community views what you might be working on, and identify specific language used by the community in discussing that. Next slide. And then you want to ensure that the necessary infrastructure is in place to support respectful and meaningful involvement of your stakeholders and partners. And again, those with critical perspective that you need. Sometimes we go out, this is an initiative, and we go engage folks and we haven't thought about the internal work that we need to do in our organizations to get ready for that engagement. So thinking through the investment of time and effort, setting realistic expectations about the resources that will be needed to identify partners, conduct outreach, build long-term relationships. And this is related to the principle about having a strategy going in. So identify and let people know how much time they'll need to invest in this effort, in your ongoing equity work. When, where, how often meetings will be convened, and for how long. Compensation is also a consideration that we're talking about a lot in the field. Identifying how you'll compensate partners and key stakeholders for the time they invest in the work. And then making sure the people leading the work have the time and resources they need to devote to the work. Is the equity engagement work just one more thing, or is it prioritized and embedded in all the work of the agency? So just a set of things to think about, again, as you approach this work. And so where does this engagement play out? Where equity considerations will be centered, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later. You know, thinking about where you'll be convening these conversations about looking at data and root causes and improvement strategies. Having a governance structure with clear communication pathways is critical. So for your county prevention plans, you may have a functional implementation team at the local level where you have the opportunity to invite these partners into the conversation. And I will stop there, and I'm going to, we want to hear from you now. So I'm going to turn it over to Dana to facilitate a couple open discussion questions. And I think we have some things in the chat. So you guys let me know if there are questions in the chat we want to address right now, or move to the poll. Or not the poll, but the open discussion.
Let's go ahead and open a discussion. There are a couple of points in the chat, and so we can certainly look at those as well. What we're interested in, and what you all said you were interested in as we designed this series, was sharing across counties and across the state, and sort of a focus on concrete real life strategies. So what we're really interested in is, how are you engaging community leaders in prevention planning? So what we'd love to see is comments in the chat, or feel free to raise a hand and come off of mute. Cindy, if you'd like to offer any, yep, exactly, wonderful. You read my mind. Come on off of mute.
So I just wanted to let folks know that here in Humboldt County, Native American youth are disproportionately represented in both our child welfare system and our probation system. Inordinately represented, disproportionately represented. And so when we started the work around the creation of a child abuse prevention plan, we sent invitations to all of the tribes. We have 8 federally recognized tribes. And then even if they didn't actually respond and say, yeah, we'd love to be a part of this, though some did, we continued on providing them with updates on where we were with the work that we were doing, using it as a sharing of information, and then, you know, asking for perspective and feedback if they felt so inclined to do that. We currently have 3 tribes as part of our community pathway. Of the 8 that we've got, 2 of the tribes in our county already have Title 40 agreements, so they're doing their own plans. But one of those tribes, the Yurok tribe, holds a seat on our cross-system collaborative, sort of as a way to continue and keep the information flowing both ways with regards to what they're doing independently with their own comprehensive prevention plan, and then what we're doing collectively in the larger county. I guess the thing I just want to say is, you just have to keep offering the invitation and offering the invitation and offering the invitation. And then you need to be humble about it. The fact of the matter is that these are sovereign nations. They have a government to government relationship with the federal government. So interacting with us as a county entity is, and I'm not going to say this quite right, so I apologize, but it's sort of a step down from the process that they are used to and expect. So you need to acknowledge that too, and kind of keep it in the back of your mind. And someone said, how are tribes being compensated for their consultations? We're at this point not actually compensating anybody right now. But we have included in the plan for within our comprehensive prevention plan for the tribes that are participating, dollars to be able to support things that they've said, that their communities have said. We did a bunch of focus groups last summer. I've talked about this before, but anyway, that their community said that they would like to have happen. So that's included in our CPP. So I'll stop.
Awesome. Thank you for
Thank
that,
you.
Cindy.
Thank you so much for that, Cindy. It's really helpful, particularly to hear about how you're working to engage tribal community leaders. There's also in the chat a number of comments around both community leadership engagement and engaging with experts with respect to meeting with school districts, supporting early intervention, public health meetings. So do take a look at the chat, and we will have, again, some additional time as we move forward to explore some of these in more detail. I'm going to turn it over now to Leanne.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Dana. Thanks so much, Yolanda, for getting this set up. And what I'm going to do now is just talk a few minutes about some applied ways to think about using your data. I love using data and I love talking about it because it's always a great starting point if you don't know what to do, or if you're stuck, or if you're going down a good path and just want to continue. It always provides an objective measure or some sort of point that folks can have a good discussion around. So if you want to move to the next slide, what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes is essentially how to understand the degree of disproportionality disparity that you may have at the local level. Also, to think about how you can track and monitor progress using data in advancing equity and understanding, are we really moving forward, and it is what we're trying actually starting to solve the problem. And again, just like I mentioned, it's a wonderful way to engage folks in conversation. I think of data points as stories, and there's always a story behind it. And if you come in with that sort of thinking, it can be a really powerful tool to get conversations going. So we'll start with the next slide. So we're going to spend just a couple of minutes talking about what I call the 3 Ds. So when we're thinking about equity, the most common equity measures that we use are, first, we simply just disaggregate data. And that's simply taking a group and looking at it by subcategories or subpopulations, race and ethnicity. But the other 2 common metrics you've heard throughout this conversation, and ones we regularly use and can be used to measure progress, are disproportionality and disparity. The distinction here is that disproportionality gives us an understanding of an overrepresentation or an underrepresentation of a particular race or ethnic group compared to its percentage in the total population. So I'll show you an applied example of this in just a moment. A disparity is an unequal outcome for one race or ethnic group compared to another race or ethnic group. Now, in child welfare, we haven't embraced looking at data this way, as well as some other systems. So for example, public health always does this. In fact, you won't see anything published in a public health journal that doesn't have data disaggregated. And in fact, if you think about a public health response even to COVID, how did we know that certain communities were being disproportionately impacted by COVID? We looked at disaggregated data. And when we did see disproportionalities, how do we understand that those outcomes, that some communities, the experience of COVID was way worse? And that had to do with unhealthy situations, marginalized communities that don't have the same access to resources. So this is a very common way to understand and advance equity. So now I want to show you a couple of examples. Next slide. Okay, what I wanted to do here is to bring in publicly available data. So this is data that comes directly from the data center, Kids Count. It's supported by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Some of you are probably already familiar with it. So I wanted to specifically draw your attention to California data. And we're just going to walk through this for a couple of seconds. The left-hand side, or that bar, and this is disaggregated data, but I've got it in a visual format rather than in a table. And I like to use visuals because I find that a lot of folks rather see this kind of information in a visual, and you can see some striking patterns a lot of times more easily in a visual format, particularly if you're not a data person. This is a very easy way to consume data. And probably many of you are already disaggregating data. So the first thing I want to show you is just to look at California's population. And this is based on the entire child and youth population under the age of 18 in California in the year 2020. Now, there's a couple of things I want to draw your attention to right away. You've got some very small numbers here that appear like it might be a mistake on the visual. And that's because they're small numbers. But a good equity practice is not to ever exclude missing or unknown data. Always keep it there. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And I also think it's a very good practice not to exclude small numbers, because maybe in research, we always say, okay, small numbers, should we collapse? Should we aggregate? That's open to debate from a research perspective. But in an applied setting, when you're trying to solve a problem like disproportionality and disparity, we need to know about all the children and youth, regardless of how small the numbers might be. So you can see that very bottom number for the child youth population is about 0.5% of the population in California or American Indian or Alaskan Native. You also see that very small number at the top. You've got 0% missing in this data for population. You can also see about 1/4 of California population is white, about 50% Hispanic, 5% is Black, 12.9 is Asian, combined with Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander, which is what Kid Count data does. Now, let's take a look at the foster care population. And again, this is real data. This is real foster care information in California. This represents disaggregated data for groups that came into foster care in 2020. And when you start to look at patterns just visually, you can start to see the problem very clearly. First, you've got missing data. That top little number, about 0.5% is missing. Now you may be saying, well, that's small. It really isn't. It represents almost 200 children and youth that came into foster care and we don't know their race or ethnicity. The second thing that I'd like to call out here is that we've got a little less than 0.5% of American Indian and Alaskan Native children, but you can't see it here on this chart because it's so small. But now we're closer to 1% represented in foster care. So let's go to the next slide. That's a disproportionality, what I just mentioned. Now I want to put a finer point on this and how you can use a disproportionality metric to first understand your problem, how significant your problem might be, and then use it as a baseline to start measuring progress. Are we really starting to solve this problem? And right here, I wanted to call out a specific example using Black youth and children. You can see it's 5% of California's child and youth population, but Black children and youth make up almost 17% of foster care entries in 2020. That is a significant disproportionality. And you can see here, the way that we interpret this metric is anything over 1 is overrepresentation. Anything under 1 is an underrepresentation. So what I like to tell folks when I talk about these kind of measures in numerous jurisdictions across the country is it's not so much what 3.34 means. It tells you, number one, you have a problem, and it also gives you a baseline to track regularly so you can see if your problem is getting less and you're making more progress towards equity. The next slide I'm going to show you is about disparity. So a disparity, as we talked about, is an unequal outcome. So to do this and to use this measure, you have to have a group that you're comparing to. So there's lots of ways to do this. You can compare multiple groups to other groups, and I'm going to show you an example of your own data dashboard in California that you can use in just a minute. But here, what I'd like to do is just show the disparity because of the entry of Black youth and children into foster care. I want to compare that now with white children. What you can see here, we've got the Black disproportionality rate clearly at the top. We calculate that same rate for white children. We basically look at the percentage in foster care and we divide it by the population for both metrics, and we get a ratio. And you can see that white children are underrepresented in foster care compared to white children and youth in the general population. So then we can calculate that disparity ratio using those two numbers, right? So we're comparing one to another now. And we take the disproportionality ratio and we divide it by the reference group there. In this case, we're comparing to white children, but you can compare this to any group with data in California. Next slide. So we know that we have a disparity problem. And this, if you didn't know about it, and I think probably a lot of folks on this call probably already know about this data dashboard that's put together and is available to you. If you're kind of wondering like, all right, well, I've got some data, I'm not sure about other data, this is a great resource. And I'll just walk you through it very quickly. First of all, you can select a time period. If you look here on the far left, now there's a little bit of a lag, but this is California data. And the great thing about this data is you can drill down at a county level and you can get county level disparity data from this dashboard. The example here I show is California, and you can see under counties, I've selected California. But you also have metrics that show you involvement at different points along the child welfare system and deeper involvement. I've got entries selected here because I wanted to show you, and I wanted it to be parallel with the examples I have been showing. But you can see very clearly here the comparison that I just showed you in the bar chart for Black children and youth compared to white children. So 4.23, basically 4 times more likely to enter care compared to white children. But you can also see and compare Black children and youth to other groups, such as Latina children and youth, Asian youth, and then Native American youth. And this is, again, a dashboard that you can use. And this is in a table format. But if you want to see it also in a visual format, because sometimes that's easier to see, then I'm going to have you move to the next slide. And this is the exact same data again. Wait for the slide to advance a little bit. In a visual format. The vertical line, anything to the right, more likely to experience that outcome. And in this case, the outcome is foster care entry. And we see compared to white children and youth, that Black children and youth, Latina children and youth, and Native American children and youth more likely than white children to enter care in 2020. And this is a pattern that's been your Asian and Pacific Islander youth less likely than white youth. And again, you can make multiple comparisons here with this data if you're interested. And you can also drill down at your county level. So next slide. So now that we've covered some metrics, I want to talk us through an applied example, particularly as we're thinking about creating a prevention system that serves children and families in a way that creates health and equity. So I'm going to invite you to think about how we can use disaggregated data in prevention planning efforts. And we're going to start with the example on the next slide. So keeping with our theme of the measure that we're really focused on, that we've talked about, is foster care. And I don't know if folks are aware of this, some of you probably are, but regularly and on an annual basis, and this has been happening for a number of years, you can see here, and this is again California data, but California data actually mirrors national patterns on this particular issue. You've got about a quarter of youth ages 12 to 17 that regularly enter foster care in California. That means you've got a quarter of teenagers that are regularly separated from their families and communities and placed into a system that does not do a very good job of meeting children's youth needs, but in particular is not very good at meeting the needs of teenagers. They're most likely teenagers bounce around a lot. It's very hard to get the right resources. A lot of times, many of them end up in a congregate setting and they don't have a family experience and their needs go unmet. This is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for all of us participating in this learning series to think of ourselves as a prevention service system. And if we all come together in a coordinated way, we will have a solution to this particular problem. Next slide. So as you're convening with your communities, your other service providers, your cross-system partners, question to be asking, and again, the story behind the data is why? Why are youth 12 to 17 entering foster care? And why has this been going on for a number of years? And we don't seem to be making much progress at stopping this practice. Moreover, we know that there's disproportionality disparities in child welfare data. We know it exists in California. So we also need to be mindful of differences between race and ethnic groups. Next slide. So I'm going to show you one metric that starts to tell a story. There are other metrics, but we're going to start with this one. What's the story behind this? So this is AFCAR's data. And if you're not familiar with it, this is a federal data reporting system that all states submit information to. They're actually required to by the federal government, so we can understand what happens to children and youth that enter foster care. And one of the things that's collected in AFCARs are circumstances around a removal. And so what you start to see here is a story that shows us there's a lot of unmet service needs. Why do I say that? Well, for one thing, what does it mean to have neglect is the most prominent circumstance for teenagers? What might be behind that? That's an interesting question to unpack, right? Because when we think about neglect, we think about that as a proxy for unhealthy community. We think of it as a proxy for unmet service needs. We think of it as an opportunity and actually something we can do something about. Next slide. But I want us to look a little more deeply at these two circumstances. About a third of this age group, and this is a pretty consistent pattern if you look at this data, in California are coming in for not being able to cope as a caregiver. And you've got another big chunk that are coming in for child behavior problems. I would argue that these at face value don't appear to be child maltreatment at all. In fact, these conditions, these circumstances, again, are a reflection of unmet service needs and probably unhealthy community. We can do something about that with a coordinated prevention service strategy. So next, let's disaggregate. We want to disaggregate because it's important to know, are there different patterns in the data? Because we also know that different populations have different kinds of needs, and we should be inviting their community to help us understand what is needed so we can prevent this particular practice. It is not just child welfare that can work on this issue. We need everyone. This is a cross-system prevention service delivery opportunity to make things better. And when we look here, first we're going to look at the orange bars. The orange bars show us the prevalence of that particular circumstance. In this case, it's caregiver inability to cope for each race and ethnic group. And right here, I show the 4 most populous groups in California and also in your foster care system. And you can see if we just look at these patterns, fairly similar. About a third of Hispanic, Black, White, and children and youth, or youth that identifies more than one race, have this indicated as a circumstance related to initial removal. The next slide, and we don't dismiss our smaller numbers, but we put them in a chart together so that we can see, because we had to do the scaling different to make sure that we can clearly see the youth that are Asian, American Indian, Alaska Native, Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander. Now, you see very similar patterns also here, around a third, except for American Indian, Alaska Native. This was not as common of a circumstance that was indicated in this data. The main other point that I want all folks to consider is the number of missing. So we've got youth in the foster care system that have this circumstance identified, but we don't know their race and ethnicity. That's something that you can have a conversation about in meetings. What are some of the challenges to getting documentation? We can also have a conversation about, well, do we need different services to address this problem for different populations? And then now I'm going to close up with a couple of more examples of our child behavior problems. So if you want to go to the next slide. This, again, is a disaggregation of this particular circumstance that's documented as one of the circumstances related to initial removal. And what we start to see here is sort of a different pattern emerges. We've got about 15% of Black youth where this is identified, 11% more than one race, around 9% white, 8% Hispanic. What does this mean? We should be having lots of conversations about what this means. And we shouldn't be shying away from it, because we know, based on our history of racism in this country, that certain groups are more likely to get labels of problematic behavior rather than seeing this as a service need and a reflection of unhealthy communities. So again, this is a data point that can invite lots of discussion. Next slide. And again, we don't suppress small numbers because we might be masking something we really need to be paying attention to. And again, you can see that there are different patterns. And even though we have small numbers of Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander, we have almost a quarter where this particular circumstance was identified. Again, this is a great topic to unpack and really think about what's going on with service needs, health of community, and so forth. And I would also ask folks, as they dig into data and you see labels like this, to have a conversation. What do we really mean by this? And do we need to really think about saying this in a different way? So I'm just going to close out and turn it back over to Yolanda. What are the equity implications of some of what I've just walked you through? One is that we all together, to stop the practice of having to place and separate youth in foster care, we need to come together with community and as a cross system and think of ourselves as a prevention service delivery system, because we can solve problems when we think about our approach this way. If we stop and we are able to prevent youth from coming into care, we're automatically going to make progress on reducing disproportionality and disparities, particularly because we already know we have a problem nationally as well as in California. In fact, all states. We also know we have to be mindful that some of our mental models, I heard that mentioned earlier, and some of our mindsets have created ways in which we identify needs as problems in certain populations, but not in others. And we always need to be reflecting on, wait a minute, what's going on here? And then finally, we need specific strategies driven by the community for populations most impacted. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Yolanda, and thanks so much for allowing me to share in this presentation with you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Leanne. We can go to the next slide. So we want to talk about then how to move forward and how to couch what we just heard Leanne talk about. Where do we couch that? Where's a good place to use as a foundation for having these conversations? And what we want to put forth at this point is using your continuous quality improvement process as a vehicle and a forum for digging into these equity issues. Of course, you can do it in other spaces and disparate meetings or other kinds of meetings, but again, we want to put forth integrating that into your routine CQI process, and we'll talk a little bit about why and what that looks like. So let's ground ourselves again in engagement, bringing in those critical perspectives that'll help inform our thinking about the data and turn it into the evidence that we need to inform solution finding to address disproportionality and disparities. So these overarching strategies kind of operationalize the guiding principles we talked about a little bit earlier. And again, we're going to frame these strategies in a continuous quality improvement context, because within the CQI process, in my view, is where the magic can happen and where the action can happen. And just to briefly look through these, again, examining your own background and biases and how that influences worldview. We talked about that earlier, has to happen. Engaging in self-reflection about your values and how those manifest into behaviors and judgments. Establishing an understanding of racial equity and inclusion principles by your CQI leaders and other folks within your agency. So those first three are around that introspection, getting yourself prepared for the work, because it is individual work. And centering the interests and values and the outcomes you're looking for on the communities that have suffered the most that we've been talking about. And that could include creating advisory boards. Again, I'm not going to go through these individually, but this set of overarching strategies, again, just to get you prepared for the work. Next slide. So engaging people to contemplate and address racial equity is a complex journey that I think we've all agreed, that requires consistent attention and action. And the CQI process, again, provides a good environment and vehicle for this. California already uses the Plan, Do, Study Act as an improvement planning vehicle in a lot of your spaces statewide and in some of your counties. Using this approach to use data to track, monitor, and improve performance around outcomes and practices that are important to California strategic direction. There are strategies that can be applied within each component of the PDSA cycle, inclusive of change management strategies and implementation science that can guide and inform your work to address disproportionality and disparities. And regardless of where you are in the CQI process, certain important strategies should be considered and applied at every step to ensure racial equity. So racial equity is a conversation in all of these phases. And these strategies should be promoted and supported by organizational leaders, of course. Next slide. So I'm going to try to step through these quickly just to show in the different phases some things to consider and think about. Again, grounding this in your continuous quality improvement process. So getting the right people to the table with the right understanding, experiences, and expertise to start the planning and problem exploration process. So putting that data in front of the right folks, making sure you have the right folks at the table that can help you understand what the data is saying. So in Leanne's applied example, partners you might pull into that particular conversation might be youth with lived experience, alumni of the foster care system, parents who've experienced the system and have tried to get services, your behavioral health partners, court, juvenile justice, probation, definitely your provider community and other community members that work with youth in your communities, and then your caseworkers, because they're working directly with youth and have a really important view as well. So those are some of the folks you might bring to the table to, again, begin this planning phase of just looking at the data to further explore the problem. And a few action steps around, you may want to, you're going to want to support their involvement in convenings where data is reviewed and discussed, and promote it in an ongoing, again, that's back to the governance structure conversation. Do you have a forum for ongoing involvement, or are you, sometimes we do the road show, a one and done, or a couple times a year, or it's an initiative where we're bringing folks together to talk for one particular issue. But CQI requires an ongoing space, making ongoing space for folks to be involved in these conversations to solve problems. Next slide. So again, still within the planning phase, and the planning phase is the longest part of the improvement planning process because you're exploring the problem, thinking through root causes, and trying to think about what you're going to do. So we hang out in the plan phase for quite a while. And you want to support the active involvement of stakeholders in the analysis of root causes of the inequities that you're seeing in the data. Why are the Black youth, why is that the disproportionate issue going on there in the applied example that Leanne talked about? Root cause analysis is an intentional and structured brainstorming to explore problem. And Edward spoke to this a bit earlier, the back mapping exercise that he talked about earlier, using that root cause analysis technique. This is a 5 whys approach, is really helpful, a really helpful way to get any and everybody involved in the conversation, but in a structured brainstorming kind of way. So in this phase of the cycle, you're hearing from parents about their experiences when they ask for help, hearing from behavioral health practitioners about the impact of certain policies and practices on the disproportionality, reviewing what types of assessments you might be using and how applicable they might be to the particular population, exploring the availability of the right services, are they in the right places, hearing from case managers and investigators about what informs their decision-making as they're bringing youth into care, and using all of this information to lift up hypotheses and thoughts and telling the story about what might be happening. Next slide. So here we wanted to share a little bit about what we know about some of the factors contributing to racial disproportionality and disparities that we see in the literature. And some related interventions that might be explored or that might surface in your work as you look at the data. And these factors include biases and inconsistencies at key decision points in the process. May be related to the need for improved worker decision-making. This might look like looking at your structured risk assessment tools, compliance with ICWA, family group conferencing, parent partner programs, and increasing workforce cultural competence. So promoting staff diversity, cultural competence training, those kinds of things. You might be looking at poverty and differential needs, as a contributing factor to the disproportionality. This might mean looking at prevention practices overall, collaborating with community-based services. We've been talking about that. The home visitation services and in-home services, efforts to increase involvement of fathers in child welfare services, differential response systems, and then community pathways. A lot of states now are looking at community pathways, and Kush alluded to this early in the conversation around that, almost that primordial prevention way upstream to avoid the child welfare system altogether. And this also includes providing economic and concrete supports. There's a lot of literature, and you'll in your packet and the resource list, there's a couple of videos and a couple of briefs on what we know about economic and concrete supports being provided to families, getting families what they need when they need it in a timely manner in our communities to avoid placement. And then finally, another contributing factor, looking at systems problems, agency infrastructure, organizational culture, resources, leadership, workloads, turnover, pointing to some of those issues as well. Looking at leadership and sustained commitment to reducing racial and ethnic disproportionality, and the overall tone of your organizations. And is it tackling this problem and articulated goal? And of course, collaborations with community partners. And some folks are looking at one worker, one family. That's not a new concept. That's been around for a while, keeping one worker with the family throughout the trajectory of the case. Next slide. So the plan phase ends. Hopefully you have your partners at the table. You've explored root causes, had those conversations and telling the story. And you're identifying some potential solutions based on the results of the problem exploration. So here you're engaging your partners in designing solutions or changes, not necessarily bringing them the solution or change that the organization has decided on and getting their input on it, but actually engaging those folks in the conversation about what a good solution might actually be, and possibly around some of the contributing factors that we just looked at. And again, this means collaboratively designing implementation of the solution and change strategy. Edward earlier on talked about the racial impact analysis. So I think it'd be really important in the solutions that you come up with to bump it up against that racial equity analysis tool. How will this particular solution we're designing, how might that play out? What might be the racial and ethnic impact of those particular solutions? Next slide. And in the ACT phase of the quality improvement work and having ongoing conversations about how the implementation is going. This is a place we don't get to a lot, is the study and act of the phase. We implement. And sometimes we fail to come back and say, well, just how is this going? And to bring those voices again, having those folks ongoingly engaged in the conversation, bringing those folks back to the table to get everybody's experience of how the solution is actually playing out. And then finally, acting, and then around communication, constant communication, developing communication plans that include consistent and ongoing communication with your stakeholders and partners and the folks with those critical perspectives, and making that visible can improve engagement and reinforce understanding that you're closing the loops on engagement and having these conversations about impacts. So again, embedding an equity lens within the CQI process, some of those benefits here to look, promoting, again, that authentic engagement. If you could imagine having those critical voices at the table in some meaningful, ongoing way and having folks engaged in looking at the data, can definitely promote engagement. Improved accuracy and dissemination of CQI results. You have key folks looking at your data and helping you analyze and respond to that data. Influencing policies and practices and resources to understand inequity. And it improves the likelihood that CQI will be helpful and actually affect communities and affect the kinds of problems that you're going to be wanting to solve. And so that concludes our spiel. Want to invite folks, if we have time, you guys can let me know if we have time, if there are any particular questions around some of this?
Please raise your hand. Have questions for this specific segment? Okay. So I'm seeing no hands going once. Going to move on to sort of bring this, sort of ground us back into some of the decisions that y'all are going to have to make locally, which is why we're having this conversation with you in the first place. Otherwise this is just, this is going to be really interesting, but it's not going to help you with your plan and your implementing your system. So how does this apply to your comprehensive prevention plan, and ultimately its manifestation? So first, this should help you start to select and hopefully at this point in time, finalize who your target population is. I'm not saying who your FFPSA candidates are yet. Okay, who your target population is. You will find candidates in your target population, but first you need a target population. And who's your target population? Sort of based on this discussion today, we invite you to think about your target population as a group that is disproportionately represented in your entry cohorts, both foster care and on the juvenile justice side. Okay, so who is disproportionately represented? Have you disaggregated those data by race, age, community, and or geographic location? Race isn't the only cut you'll want to take at it. And then you'll see this question show up sort of in each section here. What will true community engagement look like at this stage? This target population, right, ideally agrees with you that they should be lifted up, that they're in a space to be lifted up as a target population for this initial wave of creating your prevention system. Or did you show those data to these groups and ask them what they see? Share what you see and ask what they see, and get permission to actually sort of tinker with their needs and provide solutions and experiment with what works. So what does that community engagement look like to go to them and ask them, would you be the focus of our prevention continuum? Okay, then once you determined who your target population is, we're recommending at this point in time, at least, let's start at primary prevention. Okay, you'll go further downstream, but ask yourselves, how are the folks we've identified now as our target population faring with regard to the social determinants of health? Because they're going to have all sorts of needs. Which needs might you focus on first? We're recommending start at the social determinants of health. How are these folks doing with regard to economic stability? How are they doing with education and access to education, access to health and mental health? And then what does true community engagement look like at this stage? Going back to folks and saying, well, here's what our data are showing us with regard to what's going on. What do you think? And where should we focus? Where should we start? And then third, coming together in support of families. This is where we start to make our strategies and our plans for target population real. Are you going to be prepared and have the communication and the conversations you need to do locally to engage in targeted universalism? What are you going to say to folks? Say, well, wait a minute. Well, that's not fair. It's not universal. Are you going to have those conversations locally? Are you going to relocate? Are you truly going to relocate your investments where there's the best chance of closing health gaps, right? One of my mentors said, how do you know if someone's committed to something? You look at their checkbook and their calendar. That's how you know, not what they say, right? So are your investments going to be located or relocated where there's the best chance of closing health gaps? And again, what will a true community engagement look like at this stage, right? When you're actually rolling it out. How will you engage the community to figure out how it's going? Where should we roll it out first geographically? What kind of services might we start with first? What tier services, et cetera, right? So you're going back many times. So you might as well have a group that is connected to your advisory group, so you can go back to them over and over, because it's going to take a long time to reconvene folks and recreate groups to go back to. So who is that group for you? Yeah. So with that, we'd like to sort of close with a poll to ask you, so given this slide and given everything you've heard, where is your prevention planning team, right? And we'll just use that team word loosely. Could be your overarching governance structure, could be your implementation team. Some jurisdictions are big enough to have both. Some it's all the same folks. Whoever that group is, where is it? I'll have Caltrin go ahead and launch the poll.
So I'm going to launch this poll, but pencils down for a minute. The instruction on this poll, once we launch it, is to pick the level that your agency is completed at, which is to say that if you say, well, we're kind of doing some stuff in 3B, but we haven't really done 1B yet, pick 1B. Don't leap ahead, essentially. Because we want to see the highest level of completion in each of these areas. So I'm going to launch this now. And each of these 1A, 1B, 1C correspond to 1A, 1B, 1C on the slide. So pick your highest level of completed completion, if you will. We're going to give you some time to really think about this one. So feel free to take your time here. This is also a way of thinking through, as you complete this poll, where are you and what might your next step be? Where might you have to go backwards?
So Kush and Dana,
Yes.
Jay, I'm not sure if you're going to ask this question, but as people are answering this question, what if I've completed 3B, but I haven't done 1A through C or 2A through B? What should I do? Can I have completed that and be going in the right direction?
I have an answer to that question, but should
Right.
we leave it rhetorical now?
Leave it rhetorical now and let's see where we go.
I'm thinking this over, Kush, as we start to sort of have this conversation. It's interesting to see a lot of things landing in 1B. The work that we've been hearing people do with counties is often around selecting this target population, building that logic model, sort of doing that basic work. And this really lines up with that, with getting as far as using the data and how do we use the data, and then what do we do with the data? So this feels consistent with that, maybe.
Absolutely. That matches my experience, Dana, is that folks are looking at a lot of charts. Like they're looking at a lot of charts. They're starting to, charts with lots of lines with the different races with a different colored line, and starting to be able to suss out, okay, I can see disproportionality here, by race, by age, look at these zip codes. But fewer folks, right, have gone to have taken the step of taking that to the community now and saying, here's what we see. What do you see? Why do you think this is happening? Right. Yeah.
So I think we're going to go ahead and close this poll and share the results. They are actually quite interesting. One of the things, Kush, as you and I talked, if you answered, I don't know, in this poll, if you wouldn't mind just dropping in the chat what your level of involvement has been with your county's prevention team. If you're a member, if you're in leadership, if you're a community provider who has come to these forums because you want to be as engaged as you can in this process, I think I'd be really curious just to see sort of what your role is. And Kush, thinking about folks who are sort of in that 1B spot where they're at that point of using the data and sort of moving through what does community engagement look like in that selecting a target population phase. It's that shift from data to actually making that selection. Where does community engagement come into play there? I know we've kind of talked about it in really conceptual terms, but if you were sort of to talk about concrete, how do we move off of this step? What's next?
Well, so I'd actually like to see, before I answer, if one of our panelists might want to answer. So we've been hearing about sort of what true community engagement looks like, right? So what has it looked like in your work to take data to communities? Where did you take it? Who was there? What did they say? Was it did you get feedback? Right, what are the forums in which, like, where do you start when you go, oh, I think I have the smoking gun in the data, look, I've got this, but indeed, is this target population, is this actually accurate what I'm seeing? And is this target population one that would like to engage with us, given everything that's gone on? Any of our panelists want to answer that one?
Yeah, I can offer, I mean, I've seen it in a couple jurisdictions in planning for Family First. A lot of them have been statewide agencies, but taking the data doing really targeted work on understanding, looking at the data and looking at that particular community and pulling packets together to pull out that information, bringing that to the community, and having really half day long forums, doing a lot of legwork beforehand to get people prepared, and to make sure the right voices are there. And that does take a lot of work to make sure the right people are coming to the forum, and spending some real intentional time in that meeting, breaking down the data and breaking into groups and getting input from that. And then making a commitment and some connection to the community to do that on a regular basis, because people are used to the one and done roadshow for the input, but then making sure that that's a regular thing. And that's looked like once Family First kind of gets implemented, ongoing quarterly meetings. I know in a couple jurisdictions I'm working in, it's ongoing quarterly meetings. COVID, of course, precluded them from getting together in person. It's planned to really do CQI and again, break into those groups and really have some root cause analysis conversation and hard conversations, but they are doing them virtually that are working well to really put the data that they're collecting in front of folks, disaggregated by different things, by region, by race, by ethnicity, by age, and really trying to get, and it takes a while. These are sometimes half day, day-long meetings, to respond to the data. So that's what it's looked like in a couple of the jurisdictions that I'm in, and making it ongoing, again, not the one and done, but an ongoing, and letting people know that we're going to be coming back to you on a regular basis.
Yeah, that's really great. And just to pull on something you said is, are the right people there? Just the nature of the invitation. How did you make the invitation? And what are we coming to talk about? Are we coming to talk about all the problems that exist in your population, right? Is your invitation sort of communicating this power differential, right? Or is the invitation made in a way that comes in a context of partnership and takes responsibility for this social condition, rather than accidentally blaming the folks that are displaying the condition, rather than look at the equity and the system failures
And
as what we want to come talk about.
I'm sorry, I
Yeah.
also offer, as agencies, we are always inviting people into our space in our time frame during our 9 to 5. I've also seen jurisdictions or in different programs, identify places in the community where they can go and become an ask to be part of the agenda for those convenings and bringing the data to the community instead of always having folks come, to the agency at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, those. So just something to think about, using that as an option to go, to the community in the forums with it. And that takes kind of knowing your community. Again, I think I mentioned earlier, finding out the champions in the community that can help you with engagement, to know where to go, to know where those agencies are that may be serving Black and brown communities specifically, and going there, who may not be interested in coming to your forum, to your big agency, for the meeting. So just thinking about, again, being creative and kind of getting out of our routine ways of operating and being innovative and less fearful. I'm trying to think of the right word, courageous in our efforts to do things differently as organizations.
Courage and curiosity. Thank you so much, Yolanda. I couldn't have said it any better.
Yeah.
Right. Well, go ahead, Edward.
No, I was just appreciating all what's been said in the entire experience. And I was thinking to what you said, Yolanda, that this notion too of helping people, there's a trust factor in here throughout all of this. And the idea of helping people feel that they're in a safe and trusted space also makes that relationship even stronger. And that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, but it takes time and patience.
Well, it's 2 p.m. So I am going to do my good MC duty and turn it over to Caltrin to bring us home. Thank you so much for your listening today.
I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and for Casey Family Programs and Informatics for putting together a learning forum that really combined a lot of expertise and a lot of knowledge into 2 very big hours of information. The survey and the certificate are in the chat now. We would like to take a moment to let all of you know that the next forum in the series is on March 2nd. It's going to be specifically around primary prevention planning. And we've even keyed up the homework here for you. So you have a month. Bring a list of the formal and informal leaders in the communities associated with your target population, along with your team's plan to engage the community. So this is something that you can be thinking about with your team. Be sure and bring your team to the next forum so that we can have a conversation around the planning work that's happening in each of your counties. Recording and resources available within the next 2 days in the message, and watch your inbox for the next issue of Caltrin Connect. We have also, I'll mention this here, put together, you'll start to see this, a brief newsletter type message that's going to go out once a month, specifically for all of you who are involved in comprehensive prevention planning. So you are going to start to see one additional message in your inboxes that essentially collates all of the information that you might need between these forums in terms of the resources and events that are happening around comprehensive prevention planning. Again, we appreciate your time today, and we look forward to seeing you again on March 2nd.